I was an only child, first of all, and we emigrated from Scotland when I was 5 to Canada, my mom and dad and I. And I think back to stories of some family friends, and they used to come over. They had 2 kids, and they were a bit older than I am. And they would come over and play. And after one of these visits, I called her my aunt. She was my mom. She was my dad's cousin, but I called her my Aunt Nan. And anyway, my Aunt Nan called my mom and said, I hate to do this, but we really think you should, get Jim seen by somebody. He's a little hyper. He's got some issues that you should probably look at. So that's one of my early memories of childhood. And I was a fairly energetic kid. I played sports. Like, that was a major part of my life. Soccer in particular. I played soccer and hockey, and a lot of music. And so those were really that was my identity for most of my early life.
What kind of music?
So I ended up studying a bit of guitar. So I did a year of music at university and studied classical guitar. Started off just incredibly badly because I had taken lessons early on, and then I was sort of self-taught or not enough taught. And so when I actually auditioned, I didn't even have sheet music. I would just kind of learn things by ear. And the guitar professor at the University of Western Ontario, where I was, we had an audition, and he was, kind of nodding and watching and listening, and I'm thinking, I don't know how this is going. And of course, I have this $99 guitar, and anyway, he asked me what edition of the piece that I was playing was, and I didn't know. I didn't have any idea, and he just kind of nodded. Anyway, he let me in, and I thought, wow, this is great. And then on the very first night of the year, he had a little get-together at his house with there were about 9 guitarists in the program, and he's introducing all the new people, and he introduced me, and he said, oh, and then there's Jim. He said, there's Jim. He says, in all of my years of teaching, I've never, ever seen anyone with worse technique. And he said, but I couldn't believe he could actually play that stuff. So I had to let him in and see what we could do. So it was it was a kind of a real slap in the head and an opportunity. And that year I ended up doing very badly across the board in all of my courses, which again was a bit of a personality trait for me, but I managed to get accepted into the performance program, and that was like a great accomplishment, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to sustain that, and so I just kind of dropped it and still kept playing a bit. But yeah, so music was always a very important thing for me, and it's been hard to try to keep that going at any level of competency now, but it's something I'm trying to get back to a little bit now. So I have quite a mixed background. I started off and did some natural science. My undergrad degree, after my second year, I did music, and I started to do some electives in molecular biology. And my first undergrad degree ended up being in psychology and physiology. And then I went and worked for a little while, worked in a cancer lab, and was doing, just kind of fairly mundane, routine lab stuff, but started to be excited by particularly immunology. So we were working in as I said, a cancer lab, and so started doing some immunology courses and some biochemistry, and then I went back and did a biology degree, a sort of human genetics, human biology degree. And because I'd done this kind of physiology psych thing, McMaster University accepted some of the biology courses towards my biology degree, and so it allowed me to do it in a couple of years, and I didn't really know what I was going to do anyway. And it was actually during that time at McMaster that there was this really lovely man named John Thomas, and he was actually the father of Dave Thomas, the comedian, and Ian Thomas, the singer, which I found out when I was discussing my C in a paper with him in his office one day, and he had all these pictures on the wall, so we had a lovely conversation. But he taught this 2 courses, an introductory bioethics course and then a more advanced one, and this was in 1987. And he was just the most interesting person I'd ever encountered. He was really funny, and he could recite Shakespeare, and he was obviously very fluent in philosophy and things that I really didn't have much experience with at that point. And yet he could also, have these very deep and kind of profound discussions about things in biology that I was interested in, technology. So for me, it opened up this space of, wow, like there are ways of thinking like that, but bringing that to bear on some of the issues that I was more interested on the science side as well.
What was your first experience with research?
Um, my first experience actually was in animal research. My undergraduate thesis in psychology was in psychopharmacology, and I did a study where I compared well, let me back up a bit, contextualize it. So my supervisor was interested in um, non-pharmacological uh, effects on drug effects. So if you think about heroin addiction, it turns out, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, but at the time, it seemed that most heroin addicts um, who overdosed and died did so on a familiar dose, but in an unfamiliar setting. And so you'd think, wow, what's going on there? So there's something being mediated at that pharmacological level that's non-pharmacological. And so my undergraduate thesis was about trying to unpack some of those effects. And I think it was very, very demanding because it was like lab-based, 60 animals in the study. I had so I found it kind of grueling, and it didn't. I don't think I saw myself as a researcher, even though it went well and I really enjoyed it. But somehow the hook didn't go in at that point for me. Even before that experience, I think I'd had one experience that then I followed up with others where I was renting an apartment from St. Joseph's Hospital in London on Richmond Street. It was just off Richmond Street. And I had to walk across the street to pay my rent checks. This was back in the old days where you had to physically appear somewhere with a piece of paper in your hand. And there was a bulletin board outside the office where I had to go in and submit my check. And it had all these studies. And I remember there was one posted one day, and I was a soccer player, right? So I was always pretty fit. And so there was a study that was going to give people, I think it was $200. And back then it was a lot of money. It was probably my rent. And all you had to do was be injected with some radioactive dye and lie on a supine bicycle and pedal as hard as you could for as long as you could, sort of thing. So I thought, wow, okay, so that's lying down to pedal. I can do that all day. And so I went in and met them, and they, injected me with some radioactive dye, and I sat there and pedaled the bicycle and talked away to them, and it was great. And it was actually really interesting. And I was sitting in here and watching what they were doing, and I was watching I had a close scan, and I was watching my heart being scanned in real time on a monitor while I was pedaling away on the bike, and I was in good shape, so I was just pedaling away, and they were saying, keep going. And so that was really interesting. And I think in some respects, maybe that was where the road started apart, because that was pretty different than the experience of working with the rats, which I found troubling as well in lots of ways. We can come back to that if you want. But so one of the things that happened from that experience then is I got a little bit of money, which was useful. But then, I thought, well, this is kind of an interesting thing to do. So over the years, I actually participated in a lot of studies as a research subject. And someone once said to me, when you're participating in research, you're a subject. Even if people nowadays, we all like to talk about being a participant, and it's like, no, you're a subject. And my experience was that I was a subject, willing, But another study that I did was it was a study with the ear, nose, and throat department at the University of Toronto, but it was funded by NASA, and it was a study about antiemetics, drugs that make you not vomit. For astronauts, because motion sickness is kind of a big deal in space, and vomiting in a spaceship isn't so great. And it turns out, your vestibular system is kind of weird, and it first of all just responds to acceleration, and that's part one of the story. And part two is it's got these weird things. When you get it into a certain orientation, it triggers some stuff that's kind of unpleasant. So what they did is they took us up to the Air Force Base at Downsview in Toronto, and they strap you into a seat that's on the axis. It's not the thing that spins you around, it's sitting on the axis. And they blindfold you then and put your head into, strap it into this thing that's got a motor and a gear. It's like a little helmet that straps on. And it was a study where there were washouts of 2 or 3 weeks, but you do 3 different studies of two drugs and a placebo over the course of 3 visits. And so what happens is you start to speed, they start the thing up and you speed up. So you're blindfolded, but your vestibular system is reading the acceleration. But then they get you to a constant velocity, and it's quite and I've done quite a bit of neuro stuff, so I was interested in the neuroscience. And then it was quite amazing that here I am at a constant speed, and I had really no sensation. It was indoors, so there wasn't any wind, and cognitively you're just not experiencing any movement. So I thought, well, this is really cool. And then what happens is you have this little moment where you hear the motor, and the motor goes, and then you just feel your head, and your head kind of goes forward just a little, and with the rotation and this push forward, it gets you into this very strange configuration, and it triggers a signal to, I think it's, if I recall correctly, the area postrema, which is this little nucleus in your brain that reminds you that you should be throwing up now at any time. And they say it's the most potent nauseating stimulus known, and so that's what happens. And then the trial, the outcome was how long do you last? And so you have a little button, and you just push the button, and it stops. And I think I lasted about 2 or 3 seconds, and that was it. And I didn't throw up, and I was quite proud of myself because most of the Canadian astronauts who actually went into space had thrown up doing exactly the same thing. So I felt kind of some pride about that. But again, like I was doing some of these studies. I did a lot in the Addiction Research Foundation in Toronto, alcohol studies where you go in overnight and you'd drink stuff out of a flask, and then they'd wake you up every hour, and you'd go and stand on these boards and do cerebellar tests and all these things. So I did a lot of that, and it really made me interested in the science. And I think what was happening was inadvertently I was really starting to understand a bit about the perspective of a research subject. And I wouldn't say unconsciously, but later on, Susan Pilon at the University of Toronto asked me, she was in charge of our office of human subjects research at the university, and I had told her some of these stories, and she asked me to do a talk about them. And I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, but I had to kind of prepare this talk and unpack a bit about what it had meant to me. And it was quite an interesting experience to figure out where some of that came from. I think it's just inevitable that when you've been on the other side, it changes your thinking, even if you're not completely clear how it's changing. But I think that notion that something was going on in these encounters. Most of my research was really kind of interview based, but I think knowing that when you're sitting on the other side of whatever the intervention is, that something is happening. I think that's just a very healthy place to be. One of the first kind of big studies I did on my own, my PhD thesis study, was a study about assisted suicide and euthanasia in people with HIV and AIDS. And there I had what was, I think, an incredible privilege of being able to sit down with 32 people who were really trying to come to terms with what assisted suicide or euthanasia kind of meant to them at their point in their disease. And I was very much interested in the question of why people desired assisted suicide or euthanasia, because the literature, thousands, hundreds or thousands of papers, and what happens is there was a lot of kind of invoking reasons why we believe people were doing this, and some evidence, but the evidence was a little bit sketchy at the time, and a lot of people want to avoid symptoms, they want to avoid certain things. So where I came to in the conclusion of my study was that there were really two parts of it. That there was the whole overall idea for me was that this idea of loss of self, so that there was a kind of deterioration of the body. So I saw a lot of discussion about that, and so I was thinking about that in terms of kind of disintegration. And then as I heard the stories about the way people were, the way that they had been treated in their lives by their families, the way they had been excluded or shunned or thrown out of the house, just some terrible, horrible stories. And I realized as well that notion of disintegration applied just as much to their disintegration from relationships and community. So I think having that perspective of being a research subject, I think being mindful and having this privilege of hearing these deep stories, I think it set me up really well to be respectful of that and to appreciate just how much I was kind of getting from them. I was getting married and I didn't know what I was going to do. And my mom had cut something out of the Toronto Star, I think it was, a little article about a new center for bioethics that was going to be set up at the University of Toronto. And I thought, oh, wow, that would be really interesting to look at. And as it turned out, the person who was the first director, a guy named Fred Lowy, it turns out that he was a very close friend of a close friend of our family. And so I talked to Don Cowan, is his name. He was the chief of medicine at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto. And you'll see how all of this connects in a second. And so Don said to me, well, what you should do, go and talk to Fred. But before you go and talk to Fred, there's this really interesting young guy who has just come back from Georgetown University, and he's just been hired as a bioethicist at Sunnybrook. I thought, oh, wow, that sounds great. Yeah. He said, oh, his name's Eric Meslin. So you should go and talk to Eric. So I went up to third floor in G Wing at Sunnybrook and, kind of had called him, knocked on the door, and Eric came out. And so, Eric and I just immediately hit it off. And I said to him, and we joke about this still, and I said, what about jobs? Like, what about a future? I mean, what do you do? I said, maybe you have the only job in Canada. Maybe there'll never be any other jobs. And Eric said, look, he says, it's an incredibly interesting career. He says, but we just don't have any idea what jobs will look like, whether there'll be jobs. Or he said, so I can't tell you about that, but I can just tell you that it's really fun and really interesting. And of course, then, Eric, the first research ethics course I ever taught, I ever took, I was jumping the gun a bit, was taught by Eric. It was and he did the same as John Thomas had done, but with research ethics, so an introductory one and then an advanced one. And there's a little cohort of us at U of T that took them. And it was a phenomenally well-taught course, really, really, and of course, Eric had been taught by all of the people that you just listed. Tom Beecham and of course Charlie McCarthy was just a huge mentor for Eric as well. And so I then started to be included in this kind of narrative of the people that I was reading that Eric had this connection with. And I would learn, I was hearing about the NIH and the Office for Protection from Research Risks, and it just was this kind of magical set of ideas. And then so later on to go and work at the NIH and things, it was just like these circles kind of closing. So that's how I first sort of fell into the research ethics thing. Eric and I actually both have two daughters, and they're very close in ages, right? So we've gone through this whole thing in almost exactly in parallel. And he ended up being my master's thesis supervisor, even though I'm like a little bit older than him, because I had some roadblocks, I had some stumbles in my career. And Eric, of course, had a beeline trajectory. He was an outstanding student where I wasn't. But I think the way I think back to that course that Eric taught, and I think that to what he brought to his teaching, and it really was extraordinary because it was he was a great storyteller, and the stories in research ethics are amazing. And I remember the cases, and I remember hearing Eric go through the cases, and knowing people that were involved in the cases, and because the cases in a way they seemed otherworldly, they were so dramatic and complex, and then to say, oh, and this was a friend of mine here, something about that I just found really amazing. And so so we became very close, and I asked Eric if I could, do a master's degree with him, and he was my supervisor for I was his first master's student. The Center for Bioethics was, kind of up and running. Fred Lowy was the director. Peter Singer then was the associate director, and Eric was our assistant director, and Eric was associate. So it was the three of them. And we spent time shuttling amongst the three of them as students and just kind of getting time with them. And I remember Peter was always asking, what are the next big things? Like, what's the next thing over the horizon? And I always found that an interesting way of thinking. And I'd become very interested in qualitative research because, I guess I'm sort of drawn to richer narrative accounts of things, and I'm enumerate, so that's maybe one of the other reasons why I was drawn to qualitative research. But I found the stories really compelling, and I wanted to learn more about how to do that kind of work where you could elicit those stories, but in a very structured way, and generate evidence about things. So in my mind, I started to read some things, and I thought the qualitative thing could be a really useful tool in bioethics. And other people had written about this. Barry Hoffmaster and others had written about it. But then and then in parallel, this comes back to answer your question about the global part. In parallel, I met some people at the University of Toronto. One friend in particular, his name's Declan Hill, who went on to write the very famous book about how all football matches are fixed, and he's now become a bit of a global pariah in the football world. But Declan had some friends that were just establishing Médecins Sans Frontières Canada, or MSF Canada, Doctors Without Borders. And he said, we were in a course together, and I was starting to do quite well in some of my writing stuff. And Declan said, we really need someone to do the newsletter for MSF Canada. So I thought, okay. And there were phenomenal people, James Urbinski, who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for MSF. And so a really neat bunch. So I started hanging out with them at exactly that same time. And so, one day, I remember Eric and I were talking, and I said, I think I know the answer to Peter's question. I said, I think the big things are, qualitative research and the global stuff. And then I managed to get out in the field with MSF. And my first trip, I had been, done quite a lot of traveling in Europe, and I had been in Morocco, just the very north part of Morocco. So I'd had a tiny, tiny taste. But my first visit to the field with MSF was to Rwanda and Burundi and Congo at the time. And, you say to Eric, you don't need to be in a refugee camp for more than 10 minutes to kind of get it. It's a very potent experience. And so I think working with Eric, thinking about a lot of these issues, and then coming back and starting to incorporate that, it really just laid a foundation. Now, I didn't know where that was going to go at the time, and it turned out that it didn't really pan out in my bioethics or research ethics work until a little bit later, until I went to NIH. But that was the root of it. I knew what troubled me the most. In fact, I have a photograph that I use sometimes in talks. I mean, sometimes it feels a bit self-serving, so I don't use it very much. But I was in the field as the newsletter editor. It's one thing to go in and be a nurse or a doctor or an engineer that's going to dig a well, but I was there taking photographs and interviewing people and writing. And so the very first day in Kigali in Rwanda, it was raining, and we were with a Canadian nurse, Pierre Laplante, and my friend Ben and another couple of people in a Toyota Land Cruiser. And we had stopped at a small displaced camp. There were maybe about 100 people. And a bunch of these young men came up and were standing beside the truck, and I'm inside and I have my cameras, and I just had this terrible moment, the photographer's dilemma, where, I was looking at their faces and they were saying, what are you doing for me? And it was just like, wow, this was a really potent experience. So I took the photograph. And so I think that there was just something about that moment. Again, it takes a moment, and you just kind of, it captures everything. You just know, wow, there's just some deep stuff wrong here. And so that was very, very troubling for me. And I think that really stuck with me.
Did your personal mission change as a result of that?
Yeah, look, I've got to contest the mission thing. That sounds too well thought out and linear. I think it was really much more like a mosaic. I think I couldn't see a pathway to any of this. I saw that there was. Now looking back, I think there's no question it makes sense, and I can see how those things have contributed to the way I think about things and some of the things I've done. But at the time, none of those things came together and pointed towards a very specific path. So at that point, my mission in life was still to either be a rock star or play for Glasgow Celtic or Barcelona. So, I hadn't been knocked off that pedestal yet. That was to come soon. But yeah, so I hadn't incorporated that into a kind of mission at that stage yet. But I think the question's important because looking back, I think there's no question that I was incorporating it into the way that I was thinking about what might be a path. And I think I've mentioned a few times about not being a very good student, and I don't say it in a self-deprecating way. I just wasn't a very good student, and so one of the implications of that is that you know paths that were open to other students, like say professional schools and those sorts of things, were just simply closed for me. And it was a hell of a struggle to get into graduate school. And Kathy Whiteside, who has just finished her term as dean now at the University of Toronto Medical School, she was the student coordinator at the Institute of Medical Science where I did my master's degree. And I'd been working with MSF, and they're quite integrated into the medical community in Toronto. And someone had been asked to do a talk at Grand Rounds, as it turned out, at the Toronto General Hospital. And there were two people doing the talk, and one was about this refugee issue in the border of Kenya and Sudan. And it couldn't make it. And so, because I was in the office, they asked me if I would do it. And so I went and did that talk, and I guess it went okay. And I went in to see Kathy Whiteside to tell her my sob story about how I'd failed all these courses and I was never going to get anywhere with my life. And she said, "Oh, I saw you at Grand Rounds." And I thought, "Oh no." And she said, "That was really good." And I thought, "Wow, okay." And then I said, "Okay, great, here's my problem." And so she is the one that, sort of gave me the chance to kind of open that door to let me go on. So yeah, so I think that part, when I was having those experiences, it was from a perspective of really not only not having a clear sense about where I wanted to go, but really having had closed a lot of doors on myself, I think. And so, I think probably that moment where Kathy Whiteside opened that door a little bit, that was a pretty important moment, because then I could start to think, wow, maybe I can move that forward a bit now, and start to think about integrating these ideas. And of course, Eric was still very much around, and Peter at that point, and so there were opportunities to have people like that, to have these kind of conversations with, and Bernard Dickens and others that were just really, really deep thinking, sophisticated people that could help me draw that out a bit. If you look at the way we teach, say, biology, every kid coming out of high school at some point has to commit to memory Krebs cycle and how many ATP show up here, how many electrons get skimmed off there. And we learn all of these things. Now, Krebs cycle is really important, and it's important to understand some of these basic ideas in the cell and in biology. But it seems to me that there's got to be more room to be more expansive in the way that we think about the implications of science and the scope of science. I think we teach science almost like a history course, that we sort of say, and here's the next perfect experiment that was designed by someone. It's not taught as you go to work as a scientist every day because you don't know what to do. You don't know the answer, and you're trying to organize your thinking to figure out how to get an answer. I think we teach it the wrong way. So what does the average person know about global research? I would say very little. Global research, I can't remember the numbers now, but you're up into the hundreds of billions of dollars as an industry when you include private sector research activity. So you're talking about a monumental human phenomenon, really. This extraordinary enterprise that's multifaceted, and so I think it's so complex and so large in scope, and so subtle in so many ways. I'm not sure people really pay a lot of attention to it. I think when you have something like Ebola, it's an interesting opportunity, but it might be just the wrong kind of opportunity. Because it's just so dramatic, and then the overlays about, flying out the American guy and treating, the story then becomes so fragmented, it doesn't help people really understand what the underlying problems are very well. Excuse me. So I think as well as a field, we have some extraordinary people who, do a really good job in in that interface with the media. But I think the way media functions like this is not very helpful. So I think as a community, we could probably do better. What I would love to do is I'd love to spend more time, in high schools or working with teachers, working with school boards, working with curriculum people. How do you, and I mean, you talk to Eric, and Eric Muslin, he got into bioethics in part because he had an extraordinary high school teacher who introduced him to bioethics. And I think that, not just to promote the field, but to open up the way that science has implications in people's lives in all these different ways. So, yeah, I don't think people really get it. And I'm not, the other part of it is that we are so rich and privileged. Now, we have all kinds of problems in our countries as well. But just in general, as a population, we're so unusually wealthy and so uniformly wealthy as a country, even though there are incredibly important pockets of need, that I think it's just not easy for people to really grasp what it means to have somebody having to just lie down to die on a dirt ground outside a ramshackle little hut in a place like Monrovia. It's so foreign from people's experiences. And of course, as I said, when you have had an opportunity to wander around a little bit in villages like that, it doesn't take a lot to just really get it. It's so stark. It's just such a profound experience. So I completely understand why people don't get it. And it's hard to come back and say, "Oh, you should feel like this," because that's not the way we experience things. One is a very, very limited form of data. I'm going to tell you some things, and you'll do some processing. The other is that experiential learning that you get when you're confronted with the full-on scope of data when you're out there meeting people and seeing what's happening. So yeah, I think that it's still very remote for people. It's a very complicated problem, and that's usually where bioethicists start with everything. But I guess part of our training is to be attentive to the various layers of difficulty and complexity. And so, and you can never go back once you start to look at problems in a really multidimensional way. One risk is that everything looks like a really complex problem, but when applied properly, this one I think is a really, really complex problem. I think we have huge issues in the way we educate people in the formal education system. We have huge issues in terms of just saturation with information and underestimating the kinds of intellectual skills and training that are required to differentiate information that might be useful from information that might be less useful. Let's take vaccinology as an example. It's very controversial at the moment, and what happens, and people are starting to move away from this now, but people say, well, Jenny, we have the Jenny McCarthy stories, and these celebrities come on. That's part of the problem. I mean, that's a very strange phenomenon that a celebrity that really doesn't have any training in science is now purporting to be have some kind of expertise. And of course, it's implicit. She's not coming out and saying, I am an expert in vaccinology, therefore you should listen to me. She's really implicitly just using her pedestal as a celebrity, because celebrity is someone that people are willing to watch. But they're talking about the relationship between vaccination and autism, and of course it's been so well worn scientifically now that seems to be completely dispelled at a scientific level. But the story lingers with people. It doesn't matter so much what the facts are, the facts as we think of them. The story itself is powerful. So what we tend to do then is we tend to, it's the what they call the deficit model in science communication. Then it reinforces this notion that the unwashed are in a knowledge deficit and an intellectual deficit, and part of the job of science communication, of the science community, and I would include the bioethics community in that, is to help the great unwashed masses to prepare to receive the truth. And of course, there's elements of that. It's probably better that people understand that there is a decent evidence base that shows that there isn't any plausible connection between autism and vaccination. Um, but the underlying problems actually haven't been dealt with. You know, if you're a mother and you hear that story and there's some concern about vaccination and you're a friend, we know, say, from social network theory, it's going to be much more powerful, the influence about what your neighbors and your friends and your close circle and your network are doing than what, you know, a New England Journal or a Lancet or a Nature paper says. And so treating those issues as if they're just deficits that we can fill by providing the right kind of information, I think is really missing the point. And I think that, you know, what we don't do is we don't bring people into conversation in honest ways. Part of that, I think, requires humility. We get really uppity, I think, as scientists, in ways that we're probably not even conscious of. I think we're trained to be right. We're enculturated to be assertive and confident and correct and articulate in the way we get bludgeoned to death if we're not those things. And of course, an awful lot of investment of money and time and people's energy is invested in trying to improve those skills in us. And so we feel more confident in what we say, even if we shouldn't have the basis to feel as confident as we do. And so when you have problems like this, what we think we're saying isn't what people are hearing. And so we have these divides. And now what you see is rather than, and you know, one other manifestation of that, I think, is these like late night talk shows where very clever people like Jon Stewart, and you know, he's interesting, but one problem I have is that you know, they really are singing to the choir because the people that they are really often making fun of aren't watching the show, and it becomes a bit of a sort of self-congratulation in the community of people who disagree with those other people, but there's no engagement there. And so I think as a bioethics community, you know, I think we really need to be sorting out ways of trying to move past that. And I think part of that really does require some humility. It requires us to say, okay, maybe, you know, maybe we're not right about everything. And maybe even if those guys are, let's say they're just completely wrong. And let's say that it's beyond that. Let's say that being wrong in this case is actually hazardous. You know, we see measles outbreaks in Los Angeles. And this is not good. At a public health level, this isn't good stuff. But I think that the idea that just belittling people and making fun of them and trying to get them to read the Lancet is going to solve the problem. I think we're just missing it. So I think the bioethics community probably could be more creative in how we approach those problems. And it does, I think, a little bit, Gigi, get to the, you know, what I was talking about before about our broker dialogue. That kind of thing is really what gave rise to some thinking about that. How do you bring kind of respect to those encounters, especially the one, you know, or where they're not happening? How do you try to create some context that you can have those exchanges? To me, that seems very bioethical. You know, it's if we really mean respect for persons and not just respect for people who are smart enough, then I think that, you know, we got to be doing a little bit more than we're doing. You know, I have two daughters, like 19 and 21, and they're great students, and they're doing really well. But I think growing up with them, like they always joke, like they don't know what I do. They know I fly around a lot, and Olivia always jokes. I was at a meeting one time where I had to go to this island in the Great Barrier Reef on a helicopter because I missed the only ferry that day, and they said, "Oh, no problem, you can just go over in the helicopter." And so Olivia is always making fun of me. She's like, "Oh yeah, like oh James Bond, the bioethicist on the helicopter." And so but they were, as they got older, it was like, well, what do you really do? And you know, it's actually a really interesting question as a bioethicist. What do you do? I don't really know what I do. I remember took my older daughter Blair to work with me in grade 9 in her, you know, take your daughter to school day. And I thought, well, this is great. You know, I was doing a bit of teaching and I had a whole bunch of meetings and, you know, team meetings, and we're talking about interesting things. And so she sat through the whole day with me. And, you know, she's no wilting violet, but she didn't say very much. So we're all done and, you know, we're kind of heading home. And I said, so Blair, you know, you haven't really said much. Like, what did you think? She said, oh my God, Dad, you just talk way too much. So this brings me to the, you know, to answer your question, what kind of skills? I think one of the greatest services that I got as a student at the University of Toronto, people like Eric, people like Peter Singer, Bernard Dickens, was what I think of now as an intensive focus on language and critical thinking, and what Ross Upshur, calls the hermeneutics of suspicion. About just this notion of what kind of skills it takes to have a critical stance, and they're not easy skills to come by. And so, I had, it's always, I always say to the girls, the most important question is, what do you mean by that? Because we use, like, language is so important in everything that we do in our fields. We use terms carelessly, but powerfully. And so they have they do a lot of work in the world, and we use them too casually, and sometimes that goes badly. But I think that how you develop those skills, it really is you have to have a lot of people investing a lot of time with intensive interactions with you to hone them. They're not easy skills. We were talking before about guitar and music, and these are not overnight skills. They're much more like 10,000-hour skills. And so the kind of educational contexts that are going to really develop those, you need a lot of other people's investment of their time in you as well to do that. And I was very, very fortunate that I had that. So, and I felt that those skills were coming along. I think that, I was feeling confident I was getting better at those things. And then, I went to the NIH Clinical Center Department, and it was kind of just another level again. I mean, probably a lot of the people that you've been talking with, and I remember a day we had works in progress and just tossing out an idea about some ethical issues in environmental health research. And I won't get everybody right, but going around the table, there was Zeke, Christine Grady, Dave Wendler, Frank Miller, Dan Brock, Henry Richardson, Gopal Srinivasan, Mariah Merritt, Jenny Hawkins was still there, I think, and all these people. And of course, lovely people. I just loved them to death, all of them. But it was a complete flaying. You lay out these ideas, and you can just see the minds being able to kind of dissect, but very constructive. I mean, they sort of show the problems, and then offer advice and help build it up. And so for me, it was a case of, it was really like playing in the big leagues. I mean, not that Eric or Peter or the Toronto guys weren't big leagues, it was, but just having this concentration, especially with the philosophers in just this one place, was that, I mean, that 3 years there was just one of the most profound experiences of my life as well. I think just seeing them in action, those skills. So back to, my skill development, I think that also really helped hone that. It helped me stay attentive to it. And I think also helped keep reinforcing the humility. As soon as you start thinking that you've got those skills under wrap, you're just wrong. And so part of, I think, what you need to learn is to be honest with yourself, and to be okay with just being pretty good, and on a path to trying to get better all the time. And so I was lucky. I've said to Eric a lot that one of the advantages I think I had by being a really poor student, was that expectations were very low. And that actually gives you a lot of space that someone like Eric didn't have. Eric came out, the expectations very, very high. The scrutiny, the type of scrutiny, the level of scrutiny that Eric or other people like Eric were getting was very different than mine. So I had a bit more accommodation, if you like, more space to kind of develop those skills, try it out. And if I did something that looked good, it was like, oh, that's great. And that was important for me, because I think it allowed me to be nurtured a bit more than I think other people get. So, and it's also made me reflect a lot about the way we approach education. I think kids need an awful lot of nurturing, and I don't think we do it. I think we do the opposite. I think we tend to just bury them, and you wonder how many kids we lose. So I think it's the the sine qua non, right? Without which nothing. I mean, if you don't have at least a good enough handle on that core set of critical intellectual skills, and enough command of the language that you can work your way around complexity and articulate things that are understandable, I don't think anything can happen without those. So I see them as just the minimal core requirements. So yes, I mean, I think those are just always going to be essential. But I think there are some really interesting trends in the field as well. That those skills, they're not enough. They're necessary, but they may not be sufficient. And I think about the last 10 years. I've been working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the experience has been um, one of moving from what was more or less the kind of uh, academic bioethics, where we would be thinking about problems, trying to write clever things about difficult problems, and articulate positions about difficult things, which is what we do in bioethics, and then more and more being drawn into being asked to give advice on complicated problems. And our own work then has evolved almost completely now from a kind of bunch of academics thinking about problems and trying to give some advice here and there to almost completely the opposite of being asked every day to give higher level kind of strategic advice on ethical, social, cultural dimensions of the Gates Foundation's investments and their strategies in global health, global development. And so I think that what I've learned over this last few years in particular is how poorly developed my skills are in some of those areas, in the consulting side of it. In consulting in the not in the sometimes it's we say it in a negative way, consulting, because there's some reputation that goes along with consulting firms, but in the way that I think has been played out in, say, clinical bioethics or even in research ethics. And think about the Clinical Center Department of Bioethics that has run a consulting service for a long time, or these movements that we're seeing now in the CTSA awards at NIH, where we're having more research ethics consultation services. We're being pulled, though, we're a little bit different in the sense that we're getting pulled beyond just research ethics questions to more strategic questions that have underpinnings of ethical, social, cultural significance. And so it's been a bit of a trying to learn those skills on the fly, and also about bringing people into your teams that that have those skills really well developed already. So I see the future in our field is there's all kinds of scope for creativity about how we take some of these skills and perspectives out into the world and help people do good things. And again, as I was saying before, I think part of it is learning how to interact with people that are experiencing the problems. I wish that success stories in our field were like 3-1 victories in a World Cup final. I wish they were that discreet and nicely packaged and as easy to celebrate. I think a lot of our successes are kind of hard won. Um, I'll give you an example that I consider a real success, but I'm not sure that it's had the kind of impact that I would have hoped, and that might be something that someone else will pick up and move forward, or maybe I'll get back to. But when I was at NIH, we were actually at a meeting in Cape Town, and a number of us were having dinner one night, and Greg Koski, who was the former director of the OHRP, Greg and I were sitting together, and I'd known him a little bit. I'd met him a few times. I mean, NIH is incredible for that. They have very famous people wandering around your office all the time, which was nice. Greg was really, really nice and nice to me, and I had a long-standing interest in equivalent protections, which is this clause in the U.S. regulations about how to judge the procedures that are normally followed in foreign institutions and whether or not they provide protections that are the same as the ones that are applied by the common rule regulations. And I'd first heard about this actually through Eric Meslin in Toronto with Bernard Dickens, who's the law professor there. Two of them had talked about it, and I'd heard about it. And Eric, when he was at NBAC, had commissioned a paper from Bernard Dickens on this. And so I was very interested in it. And my very first week at work at NIH, I ended up at a meeting in Delhi in India where the Indian Council of Medical Research, the ICMR, revealed their new research ethics guidelines. And I was there with Jerry Kirsch and Melody Lynn and Dave Wendler. And the very first question that Dr. Ganguly, who was the director at the time, asked was, well, now that we have our guidelines, does this mean now that we can get, equivalent protection status? And Melody Lynn was there from OHRP, and we had this discussion about what that might mean. Anyway, I was having dinner with Greg, and we were talking about this, and I had some ideas about it, and Greg said, if I put together a working group across the Department of Health and Human Services, would you chair that? And I thought, wow, okay, what an honor to do that. So that working group was an incredibly interesting experience. So we had to kind of try to unpack this regulation, try to come to some way of making sense of it and how you might go about implementing it. And so I chaired that. It was a very hard-working committee. We did a lot of great work, but I feel like I had a good, strong hand in that. And I'm very proud of where we ended up with that. That piece got, published in the Federal Register. There was public comment, and for someone who did a bit of policy as well, I mean, very, very exciting. And so for me, at one level, a great success. But then it hasn't been taken forward. So it's a little bit in, in sports terms, like playing really well or improving or getting just so close and then getting stopped. But I think it's actually also a fair example about what constitutes a success, because we do focus on very difficult, complex problems, and that's not made up. And they're not always so discrete. And so I think part of the skill set as well is learning to see those things as successes and not see them as failures, because it was very disappointing in some ways. But a lot of it feels that way. I mean, when you asked me the question, I paused, and it's not out of any false modesty. I would love to be able to just pull out a bag full of great successes, but it doesn't feel like that most days. It really feels like helping people struggle through complex problems, and with uncertainty. And so, if there were more really clean-cut solutions, then it may not even be our field. For the record, as one thing that's been an incredibly interesting experience for me in my bioethics career. And again, I'll come at this indirectly, as to do with everything. We focus an awful lot on and this has a primer angle, this story, but we focus an awful lot on the pharmaceutical industry, drug companies, and I think the general feeling towards drug companies in the research ethics community is that they're just they haven't been good actors in this space, and there's quite a negative view of them. And I was actually at a primer meeting, and I was giving a talk about some trials, and I mentioned, I think, a trial that had been conducted by Pfizer, and it was been talked about a lot, but I talked about it, and I had some thoughts about it. And then later in the week, I got a call from someone who at the time I think was an in-house counsel at Pfizer, and said, I was at your talk, and sort of interested in your comments, and we're putting together this initiative. We're trying to make some improvements within industry. And so anyway, so he invited me to another meeting, and I went, and I was at a point in my career where I felt like I could say what I thought, and and of course at that point already the drug companies they'd had their wrists and virtually every other part of their body slapped, and so the way that they were approaching bringing people in, even if it was on a small contract thing, it was small and modest. I mean, I could make more money going and doing work for the Ministry of Health on a project. So there was no kind of lucrative deals to be had about doing consulting with them, sort of thing. But I agreed to do a couple of things like that, and it felt weird. And I talked to some of my colleagues about it, and people were nervous about it. And anyway, later on, after a couple of other things that I had done, I was invited to sit on the bioethics advisory panel at Pfizer, and very nervous about it. And fortunately, another one of my very good friends and a real gem of a person, Bartha Knoppers at McGill University, Bartha had agreed to sit on this panel as well. And so we arrived in New York, and we worked out a deal in terms of the terms of reference of this committee, where essentially Pfizer brings 50% of the agenda. And we bring 50% of the agenda. Jeff Kahn is also on this committee now as well. And so I remember one of the very first agenda items that I brought was, I thought, okay, this is a platform where if this is going to be authentic, then we should be airing issues that we in our community feel are important, and we should be airing them on our terms. And so, I sent a whole pile of reading from Trudeau Lemons, who's a law professor at the University of Toronto, but who really focuses a lot on the behavior of drug companies, and uses legal discovery to get underneath and find out what's really happening. And so I did a session about fraud in scientific writing, and the implications and the practices and what was going on, and essentially in a respectful way, but just sort of put that out on the table. And what has fascinated me so much about this experience, and one of the reasons I wanted to raise it here, is that it's been completely different than I expected. The response from the people at the table has been, overwhelmingly positive. They want to engage in these issues. Now, how far up the organization this goes? It's a committee at the level of the medical director, so it's fairly high up. We have quite a lot of directors. We've had some vice presidents come in and do presentations. We've had associate general counsel, fairly high level. Don't know if it gets into the C-suite, whether the CEO is paying attention, whether it's really making a lot of changes. But what's been fascinating for me is how much appetite there is to engage honestly about important questions that we look at and have problems with, but that as employees of that company, people look at them as well and say, I don't want to be in a company that's doing things that are unethical. And so it's been one of those moments for me of, I was reluctant at first. I'm still doing it now, in part because I see, we're not doing enough about reaching out across those divides. We're not going to people we're not seeing them as a population of people in a company that are struggling with difficult problems. We're too ready, I think, to jump and label them as bad actors. And I think that's not good for us as a community. I think we need to get better at figuring out how to go and reach out. We need to keep the critical lens. And we do this in the committee. We say what we think, and we bring agenda items that are hard-hitting and fair and honest, and there's no punches pulled. But I wanted to add that because I think that kind of change in the way that we engage and relate to industry or other areas where we haven't done as well is maybe another direction for the whole community to start taking more seriously. And as we've been talking about, I think it does require different skills, and it requires an important understanding, I think, about what companies are faced with. I mean, we were, one of our last meetings, talking a little bit about corporate social responsibility and some of the challenges there. Again, these are things that are fundamentally about ethics and about the things that we talk about, but the contexts are slightly different. So yeah, I think that for us to continue to be relevant and back to your point before about how we get our message out more broadly in society, I think we have to start having more of those engagements and being able to bring those skills to bear in constructive ways.